This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
What is the deal with Mount Hermon? I mean, seriously, what is the deal? Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Joining me to discuss this for episode number 33 of our monthly Iron and Myth series. And that number will be very appropriate, as you will learn during this conversation. We are a man down this month. Sadly, Brian Godawa could not be with us tonight, but we are joined by the author of Giants, Sons of the Gods, in the 10th Anniversary Revised and Expanded Edition, among other books, the pastor of the Reformed Baptist Church of Northern Colorado in Boulder, Doug Van Dorn, and our friendly neighborhood PhD, author of Interview with the Giant, Ethno-Historical Notes on the Nephilim, and the Nephilim Dossier, director of the Institute of Biblical Anthropology, Dr. Judd Burton. Guys, this is a subject that I'm surprised we hadn't already addressed, given that we're 33 episodes in, which means, 2 years and almost 2 3/4 years of doing this. And Mount Hermon comes up in so many conversations that we haven't tackled it in its significance yet. But it's even more significant, maybe some of us realize. Judd, I know that you did your doctoral dissertation on Caesarea Philippi at the base of Mount Hermon. We will touch on that. But Doug, I know you want to jump into something that's even more esoteric and surprising about Mount Hermon, some of the connections made by the late and lamented David Flynn.
Yeah, I think first, though, I need to say that, Judd, you might say that what we're about to talk about tonight is pregnant with meaning. You like that shirt there? I wore it for you. I think the context of you saying that on Blurry Creatures was talking about Mount Hermon.
I'm quite certain that it was. Mm-hmm.
Tell us where to get that shirt, Doug. Who's got that shirt? Is that from Blurry Creatures?
This is a Blurry Creatures shirt, and they put this together when they were raising money for Judd and his health and all that. And I don't even know if they have any more left, or if this is now an antique. I don't know, but if you get it, it would be over on the Blurry Creatures website.
Okay, Nate, Luke, come on, let's cut a deal. We'll add them to our store too.
Well, there's no shortage of T-shirt production there, so who knows? It might find itself on another version.
Yeah, so let's talk about David Flynn, shall we?
He was a unique thinker.
Mm-hmm.
He was just genius. One of the most incredible men I've ever heard speak. And he really only had one main talk. He did a lot of other interests, but his talks they were always given down in Roswell, and he sometimes did that with Dr. Heiser, who was at the same conference. And you can listen to 2 or 3 of these online. And I know, Derek, you have some links to some interviews that you had with him back 2005, 2006 that you'll be showing underneath the show here.
There'll be a bunch of links in the show notes, both to our stuff and to whatever videos I can find from those, what were they called? Ancient of Days Bible UFO conferences.
That's right. So this first started for him, I think, because there was a crop circle that showed up in 2002. People have probably seen it. It has a little alien head guy, and then he's holding a disc. And the disc has 33 levels of coded text. There's our number. And that's why we thought it would be fun to do our 33rd episode here talking about Mount Hermon. But it actually begins for him with Roswell. Apparently him and his brother Mark back in the 90s, so this is about 6 years before the crop circle came out, they actually had a little an image, a desktop image that they had created for, I think, Mark's cybersecurity company or something like that, and it looked exactly like what this crop circle ended up being 6 years later. And I think he was just floored by that, completely blown away, and that caused him to start looking into this thing. And of course, the Roswell crash takes place on the 33rd degree latitude, and there's a whole bunch of wild, you can call them coincidences, or you can say that there's something much more mindful going on with that crash that he goes into. But I think we're more interested in what's taking place on the other side of the world. That he actually connects in his talks to this 33rd degree parallel, and that is that Mount Hermon is found on this 33 degree parallel. And of course, this is where in the book of Enoch, the Watchers come down on Mount Hermon. And so one of the main questions would be why? Pre-show, Derek, you were asking, like, why Mount Hermon? It's not even in the top 100 mountains, tallest mountains in the world. It's probably
Right.
not even in the top 10,000 tallest mountains in the world, honestly. It's not even 10,000 feet tall. Why in the world why would the Babylonians remember this? Why would the Greeks say that this was the beginning of all of history, was here at this place? You know, those are some pretty crazy questions. And I think he might have started to put his finger on the pulse of why that would be. He kind of begins by remembering this story of the dragon in Revelation 12, where the dragon's tail sweeps a third of the stars out of the heaven. And of course, the dragon there is Satan, but a third is 33. If you just do, one third, do the multiplication, it's actually 33.333333 forever and ever and ever. But there's our number again. And it just happens that Mount Hermon is on that latitude. I'll just give you a brief rundown of some of the things that he talks about here that are all kind of related to this, that are super interesting to me. The word dragon in Greek can mean to watch. So the idea of a watcher. Yeah. He talks about how this is the land of Canaan. And then he gives some etymology for Canaan in Latin. Of course, it means a dog, but in Greek, it means a rule. And then he gives some related words, one being canon, from which we get the idea of law or measurement. So a canon of law. And so this is a place that might have to do with measuring things. Okay, that's pretty interesting. This is what the land is that they're in. He gives a quote from Nonnus, Dionysia. It says, from the beginning of time, people lived here, a people of divine progeny. Their age is that of the universe. So this is what the Greeks were actually thinking. Nonnus is an Egyptian kind of Hellenist, but still, same thing. Then he starts talking about Europa, the goddess Europa. She was actually a princess of Cydonia who was kidnapped and brought to Crete. And when you look at all of her, the depictions of her, she's like this wide, bug-eyed woman. And this is because Europa actually means wide eyes, someone who sees really well. And it's actually, Europa is related to Ophis, which is a word for a snake. And it's related to the word for an eye. And so then he takes this to Eve. And he says, basically, when Satan is tempting her, this is the first transfer of heavenly knowledge to a human being from a watcher, serpent, dragon creature. And he says, your eyes will be wide open. In other words, Europa.
Europa.
That's pretty wild.
Mm-hmm.
Then he goes to the pictures, especially in the Renaissance, of Eve and the fruit. And most people think that the fruit that she's eating is an apple, a golden apple, maybe coming from the Greek mythology of the Garden of Hesperides or something like that. But it's actually a quince, very specific kind of fruit, the fruit of heaven. And the quince was actually, its scientific name is Pyrus Cydonia. And so there we have Sidon again. And he tells a story of how, I think it's Pythagoras, used to hand a quince to his students, and if they cut it the wrong way, he wouldn't train them. Only if they would cut it along the equator would he say that they are worthy students to be taught by the master. So what happens is when you cut a quince along the equator, you get a circle, which is the fruit. That is then, you get 5 seeds that look like a pentagram.
Which, of course, is what
so
the Pythagoreans had on their hands.
Yes, and this becomes the famous star that is inscribed by the circle. That you'll see it upside down. It becomes a satanic symbol. In esoteric art and stuff, the circle becomes the Leviathan, the Ouroboros that is eating its tail, and then the five angles of the pentagram. You'll see that in a minute how this all is related to what we're talking about here. But as we keep going, we're sitting here in Cydonia. We're talking about a princess of Sidon. We're talking about a fruit of Cydonia. He then goes how Mount Hermon is called actually Sirion by the Sidonians. So that's what Mount Hermon's name was. And it turns out that Sirion and Sirius are quite related. Sirius is the dog star. That's the brightest star in the sky. And then when you go back to Greek geometry and, again, Pythagoras and Homer and the myths and all this kind of stuff, you start learning that they actually did something really interesting, which is very important for navigation. They tethered the heavens to the earth. So latitude is something that you can get by just looking at the angle of the sun across the year. But in order to do longitude, so that you can then navigate the seas, you have to have a fixed point on the earth, someplace that becomes zero. So we call this the prime meridian. Today it goes through London. Before London, it went through Paris. We'll talk about that in a minute too. But that's how you tether the heavens to the earth so that you can navigate. But it does something more than that, because for the Greeks, they actually talked about how Atlas was the one who was the keeper of all this true knowledge of how heaven and earth are fixed together. And so Atlas would hold up heaven and earth, and that's the picture of him holding like this, like as if his arms become pillars, you see? And pillars, Atlas, the myth was that Perseus showed the head of the Medusa to Atlas while he was holding up the earth. And when he did that, he turned to stone, and Atlas became the Atlas Mountains. Well, it just so happens that the Atlas Mountains go right through both the London and the Paris prime meridian. Furthermore, you find that the same thing is true of the dog star. So now the dog star is actually being tethered to the prime meridian as the brightest star in the sky. And when you do that, now all of a sudden you've got all these fixed points in the heavens. Okay, so you've got over Europe, you have the twins, the Gemini, which are represented as pillars, which is exactly what Atlas was doing. And then you start finding some really weird things like the Taurus Mountains. So when you lay these out, you have the 12 constellations that are going around the Earth in a fixed way. They never move now. And you can start to tie constellations to things that are below them on the Earth. This is why the Atlas Mountains are where they are in North Africa, and they're not somewhere else like in China or Australia or something like that. They're there for a reason, and the ancients knew this. In other words, the meridians that we have today seem to somehow reflect the ancient prime meridian idea of ancient times. So it gets really weird, really, really interesting from there. But for our sake, people need to understand that you're tethering constellations to the earth, and ancient peoples would then they would name things after this. So you have the Taurus Mountains in Turkey are right where the constellation Taurus would be. You have Orion, the hunter, is right exactly where the three pyramids are, where the three pyramids which reflect the belt of Orion are. Mm-hmm. You have Leo the lion is right over Peru, and this happens to be Cusco. Cusco is actually all those giant megaliths that people see in Cusco. Those are actually creating a giant puma, which is a giant cat or a lion.
Oh, wow.
And this goes on and on. The founding myth of Mexico happens to be right where I forget which constellation it is. But if you look at the Mexican flag, I think it's a serpent with an eagle on it or something like that. Well, that's just exactly where that would be. And they built Mexico City on this swamp thing. Mm-hmm. And United States is right where Virgo is. And of course, you have Washington, D.C., and you have the Statue of Liberty. You have Maryland and Virginia and Annapolis. All these things right, converging on Washington, D.C., where our capital is, right where sheep resides over. And this is just wild, weird stuff.
Well, that's David Flynn. One of the interviews we did with him talked about the connection between Babylon and Washington, D.C., and it's coming back to me now, but this relates to that. And again, this will be one of the links in the notes below this program. But not coincidentally, in the pre-flood world, Pangea, the Atlas Mountains, and I thought I remembered this, the Atlas Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains were actually connected. Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So, we could talk about this forever and ever, and trying to wrap your head around this is really difficult. I've probably watched some of David's videos at least 20 times because you can always get more information out of it. And it's hard because this is very esoteric stuff that we're talking about, but it relates to Mount Hermon in some very strange ways. And it's not just the number 33. So what you have is that this becomes ground zero for where, the Watchers decided to teach humanity all the things that, Enoch says. And that includes the sciences of the stars and astronomy and all this kind of stuff. And why would they need to know that? Well, there's probably lots of reasons. Maybe you need to know it for harvesting, but maybe you also need to know it to create calendars. And maybe it's not just a little calendar. Maybe it's also a giant calendar. And that takes us to the great year, which David talks about. The great year is something people need to understand. We measure a solar year by the time it takes for the sun to take the Earth to go the sun revolution for 365 days. So we measure it by that. We get our 4 seasons and we get our 12 constellations and all that kind of stuff. But there's something called a great year or a Platonic year. And this is actually something that takes place over the course of almost 26,000 years. And it has to do with the fact that the Earth is like a top that's spinning on its axis, but it wobbles slightly. And as it wobbles, it takes the axis of the Earth 26,000 years for it to go one time around that vertical axis, which is an insanely slow amount of time. And there's like, how in the world could anybody ever know this? Well, it's because the Watchers are the ones that taught it to us. Now, how does that relate to anything? Well, the main way is that it relates to it as the circle with the pentagram. So if you take 360, which is the number of degrees in a circle, and then you multiply that by 72, which is the angle of each of the 5 angles in a pentagram, you get the magic number of the great year, 2000 or 25,920 or whatever the number is. And so the great year is such an interesting thing for this era. Judd and I are convinced that the Serpent Mound, which is at the base of Mount Hermon in one sense, just about 5 miles south of the 33rd degree parallel, but probably they picked it because this was maybe a natural formation that was already there, or they were able to manipulate it or whatever. It happens to be exactly due south of Mount Hermon. And it seems to have been a giant calendar, a giant clock that was in some way commemorating when the Watchers came, most likely at the opposite end. So if we're at 12 o'clock, it would have been at 6 o'clock. That's when it would have either been made or when it was commemorating. And that seems to have been when the Watchers came down to Earth. So it's commemorating that. But the weird thing about it is, remember how I said that the circle is described as a Leviathan and Ouroboros? Well, that is the imagery of the circle with the Gilgal Refaim and the serpent put together. It's Ouroboros stuff. And so what that means is that you've got in the Serpent Mound and wheel alignments that are reminding you of the great year. And that kind of takes you into all kinds of weird eschatology and abilities to map out time over the course of 26,000 years. And of course, you've got navigation, and from there you can spread around the world, and on and on and on the implications of this go. Well, it all begins there at Mount Hermon, and Hermon seems to be kind of ground zero for the Leviathan itself, you guys, which is such a strange idea.
Oh,
the Leviathan, who is the keeper of time, if you want to call him that. And of course, then from a Christian point of view, he's also the one who is Satan, who taught, in a general like metonymous way of speaking, he's the one who taught humans all this knowledge that were we even supposed to have it in the first place? I don't know. So that's kind of an introduction, as simple as I can make David Flynn and still make it relevant to what we're talking about tonight with Mount Hermon and the 33rd degrees.
So the great year is 25,800 years. So half that would be 12,900. And if we're looking at a quarter of that then, so it's 6,000 6,950.
6,400 years, something like that. Yeah.
Well, that'd
And
be 12, 6450. Yeah.
effectively, each one of those four, so you can cut it down from 12, right? So a great year. Then you can divide it into four. So you got essentially the four seasons of the great year. Those match up with the coordinates of the four points of the compass, which would be Leo, Aquarius, so the man, the bull, the lion, and the eagle, serpent constellations. But you can also divide those then into 12 pieces, and that would get you the 12 zodiac constellations. And each one of those, you move through those roughly every 2,000 to 2,200, 3,300 years, something like that. And this is where we get the whole idea of the age of Aquarius that they sing about in the song in the 60s.
Right, right.
We're entering the age of Aquarius, which in the great year is very strange because it begins both a new month and a new quarter and a new year. It actually begins the whole cycle all over again. So we are essentially either on December 31st or January 1st of this great clock that God has put into the sky through which we measure all of time. And if that isn't mind-blowing, I don't know what is, because the implications of that are just stunning. Jesus effectively ushered in the 12th month, which is the age of Pisces. And Pisces is why, Christians were called little fishes, and the baptismals were called fish ponds. And Jesus says, "I'll make you fishers of men," and on and on. That kind of imagery goes.
Well, the astrologers believe that the official entry, the final entry into the age of Aquarius, began on the winter solstice of 2020, when Jupiter and Saturn met in conjunction at 0 degrees of Aquarius. So,
David put the clock at 2012 because he was, of course, dealing with the Mayan calendar when he made those videos. To me,
right.
I'm perfectly willing to say that we have a 100 to 200 year kind of overlap, but we just don't know where we enter it. But nevertheless, it's not 500 years. It's not. This is not something that's just anybody's guesswork at any time. It's a clock. Yeah. It's real, and you enter it at some point in time, and you're out of the other one at some point.
Well, I remember David writing about that, though, and that was the date, the winter solstice of 2012 is when the constellation, if I remember correctly, Sagittarius emerged from the mouth of the Ouroboros.
Exactly. And, I always thought it was so interesting that the Lord would choose to take him literally in that month of that year as when
You're right, he did. We did a show on PID radio about that back in December of 2012. Wow.
As esoteric as all of this is, it is still illustrative of the ancient and prehistoric mind, which is something that I always tried to begin my world civilization classes with, is that there's a mindset that the farther back in antiquity you go, and especially into prehistory, Doug, you were laying out all of these connections between what we would subdivide today as different disciplines, astronomy and geography,
right,
and so on and so forth, and farming and
geometry.
Yeah,
yep.
but that's not how ancient and especially prehistoric peoples thought at all. These were all parts of a whole. They were the sciences, so to speak, were not unconnected. And the breakdown in terms of the academic approach to all this stuff is where the anthropologists and archaeologists and historians typically get it wrong, is that they're not using the missing pieces that we are to explain all of this. And that is that this stuff was taught to humanity by a vastly superior intellect from outside of our realm of existence. There's a really good book that I always point people to that helps to explain some of these things. Hamlet's Mill, which came out I think in the late 70s or early 80s, but it hits directly on this, and just in terms of academic writing, that's about as close as you get to embracing somebody embracing the supernatural component of all of this equation. But I posted something on Facebook the other day about myth being a lens to better understand the Bible. What you just did is exactly what I'm talking about. Because the writers of the Old Testament and the New Testament understood this stuff. Their audiences, to a degree, understood this stuff. The culture at large, to a degree, to the degree that it intersected directly with their lives, understood this. And I think that certainly what Mike Heiser did during the course of his career sort of brought us back to taking a closer look at that. And I hope, well, I'm quite sanguine that we're continuing that legacy with what we're doing here tonight.
I've got to go back and correct myself real quick. Doug, you were right. 25,920 years is where.
Yeah, 25,920.
Yeah,
that's right.
yeah.
You brought up Hamlet's Mill. When I first started thinking about this stuff, it was actually through Graham Hancock in his Fingerprints of the Gods, who brings up Hamlet's Mill, and then later through Randall Carlson, who is his friend. And what I find so interesting is that the work that David Flynn was doing was independent, although it might have had Hamlet's Mill as a common source, but it was still nevertheless totally independent of Graham and Carlson. And those two guys are coming at it really from a very non-believing worldview and even a Gnostic worldview.
Yeah.
And so, people might get scared away by that kind of a thing and say you shouldn't even touch this stuff. But what I just so appreciated about David is that he's a Christian who is Orthodox Christian, and he is not doing weird Gnostic stuff with this, but he's trying to understand the Gnostic mind, because he understands that the Gnostics were privy to information about how the world works that really is helping us to understand what was going on with the Watchers and what they were teaching us, and why it is that the Jews said this was such a bad thing.
So looking backward and coming back to your point about Gilgal Refaim and the Serpent Mound there in Bashan as a sort of clock pointing backwards to the time when the Watchers came down. We're looking like, what, halfway backwards through the cycle from where we are right now? So roughly...
Right, it would be roughly the time of when Plato says Atlantis was destroyed, when Göbekli Tepe was made, whether you want to date the flood to that era or not, that would be the idea. That's kind of what Carlson would do. And I think David Flynn did the same thing, actually. I'm not dogmatic about that. I think Judd probably prefers that idea. Don't want to speak for you, but that's basically it. And so that would be halfway around the Great Year.
So roughly 13,000 years backwards from where we are right now.
Right. Carlson has some really, really interesting stuff that he says that whenever you come into one of the four quadrants, so that would be Aquarius, what we're entering now, or one of the other four, as you enter it, this cycle of catastrophes ramps up exponentially, and they're not really sure why, but as they date back every 6,000 years, you can find some kind of a horrible thing that happens that you really don't see happening during the middle of those periods of time at all. It just happens at those four periods, which is pretty strange.
Well, it's interesting that because as Dr. Mike Freakman told us when we were there at Gilgal Refaim with him last spring, that the dating of that site, contrary to what was originally proposed by the first excavators, they put it in the Middle Bronze Age, about the same time frame as Stonehenge, about 2500 BC. He dated it to about 37, remembering his paper, 3710 BC, give or take 180 years. So roughly 3700 BC. But he found an older wall when he was excavating there back in 2009, I think it was, that had been dismantled. So you're talking about a site that had been used for some ritual purpose going back, and that fits pretty close to this, a quarter of the way around this clock.
A quarter of the way. It is. Yep.
Wow. So,
yep.
Okay, so a lot of those megalithic sites there on the Golan, which we saw, and of course we visited that other one called Kerbet Beteha, which is near ancient Bethsaida, very similar to it, where you've got concentric rings around a central core, which, Dr. Freakman thought was to facilitate ritual circumambulation, the ritual of walking in a circle around a sacred spot, connected to the idea of the Ouroboros eating its tail?
You want to give that a
Yeah,
go,
I would
Judd?
think so. Any sort of, well, it speaks to a couple of things really. The circumambulation, and if I'm not mistaken, didn't Freakman say that he thought that it was counterclockwise that they were circumambulating?
Yeah.
Okay, so that already is an
Moon gods
indicator,
were
but
so.
the it's the location, but it's also the shape that's being used here that's significant. The complex, as we've come to call it, the Serpent Mound and the Gilgal Refaim circle, sort of exuding this Ouroboros imagery. I really don't see how you can get away with it. Number one, the circle in world religions typically represents the celestial, the transcendent, the otherworldly, the spiritual, as opposed to the earthly or the mundane. And the shape of Gilgal Refaim, in fact, its layout is reminiscent of a coiled snake at any rate. So I would say that there's certainly enough there on top of just the snake imagery itself to suggest that it's an Ouroboros, that it's this idea where something something is being communicated between two worlds. And if Doug and I are right about the Watcher connections here, the serpentine imagery of the seraphimic Watchers is certainly at play here, and to this day remains part of the not just the shape of the sigil itself of the Baphomet, but the more esoteric idea behind the Baphomet.
And there's one more piece to this, Judd, that the rabbis talked about something called the Tili, and the Tili is essentially the Leviathan. And they used Isaiah 27:1, where Leviathan's going to be destroyed on the great day, to talk about how there was actually two Leviathans. There was a male Leviathan and a female Leviathan, Leviathan the straight and Leviathan the crooked. And when you kind of put the two things together there, the Serpent Mound on the wheel, you essentially have the Tili, and especially if it is already symbolizing Leviathan in terms of the great clock, you now have the male and the female, which is, of course, also represented by the sperm and the egg. And when you look at the shape of the Serpent Mound itself, man, it looks very much like a sperm. And of course, the wheel looks like the egg. And so now you have fertility stuff that's going on as well, and takes you back to origins. And of course, that makes you think of Garden of Eden, and it makes you think of when the Watchers came down and saw our women and all other kinds of things that are related to that.
Well, and sort of continuing on that thread, a survey of serpent mounds around the world will show you very quickly that the image of the undulating serpent and an associated egg shape or circle shape is more often than not found together. Yeah, near ubiquitous. Yeah.
Sometimes it's swallowing the egg. Sometimes it's in the very same position as what you find at Bashan, where you have the serpent on top and some sort of a circular feature below it. You find that out in Canada. You find that in the Avery complex in England that used to be a shape of a serpent, and it's just found everywhere.
Taking us back to the summit of Mount Hermon, when Sir Charles Warren found that temple on the summit with the the Watcher's Stone in it. He also found a stone wall that required people approaching the summit, which apparently had been scooped out at some point in history for a libation ritual. You had to approach it by circumambulating counterclockwise.
Well, that's right. So you're actually making the same kind of motions that you made around the wheel, aren't you?
Well, yeah. According to Dr. Freakman, his mentor, Joseph Garfinkel, and in fact, I took this and cited him in our forthcoming book, The Gates of Hell, found that in a study of prehistoric artwork, especially in the ancient Near East, 80% of artwork depicts humans dancing, but in the ancient Near East, they were always depicted in left profile, meaning that they were going counterclockwise as they danced. So
fascinating.
Yeah, because according to Dr. Freakman, that was a thing with Jews at the temple, but it certainly is still practiced today in large numbers by Muslims going to the Kaaba in Mecca.
The Kaaba, yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
and
they
it's
do the exact same thing.
it's a direction of magical working in any number of traditions today, not the least of which would be neo-paganism. They use an old, it's either Old English or a Celtic derivative. There maybe from both, but Widershins literally means counterclockwise in the neo-pagan traditions.
There's something else there that's related. When you take the great year number, the 25,920, divide it by 12, you get 2,160. And that happens to be the diameter of the moon. And so you have the idea of moon god worship that's associated with that number. And, there's quite a few people that have talked about Islam having originally come out of moon god worship. And so the circumambulation going in that direction seems to fit that idea too.
Here's another interesting detail. This was in that paper that I sent around by Edward Lipinski called El's Abode about Mount Hermon.
Right.
The summit of Mount Hermon being scooped out apparently was for the purpose of a ritual in Hebrew called Yarid, which is based on the same root as Jordan, meaning to come down. And so in the book of First Enoch, where it says the Watchers descended in the days of Jared, which is the same word, it wasn't necessarily in the days of the patriarch Jared. It was in the days when the Yarid ritual, this libation or drink offering, was poured out on the summit of Mount Hermon. And it was known well into the Christian era. Diocletian in the late 3rd century, Roman emperor. There's an inscription that was found at Tyre, who performed the Yarid for his brother Hercules, who was the Greek and Roman name for the god of the city, Melkart.
That's interesting because there's a mile marker put up near Caesarea Philippi during Diocletian's reign. I wonder if it's part of the same project. Interesting.
The thing that's really, and then you take this a step further, in the time of Elijah's confrontation with the priests of Baal, given that Jezebel was from Tyre, her father was the priest king of Tyre. If the Baal of Tyre, the lord of Tyre, was actually Melkart, then Elijah was mocking Melkart when he sent the boys down to get the buckets of water that they poured on the wood before setting it on fire. He was performing the Yarid for Melkart and saying God's going to, is going to destroy the sacrifice anyway, consume it with the fire from heaven. So again, apparently this can be traced back to Mount Hermon. The references to Hermon in Scripture, and again, if it's just that it's a tall mountain, and it is the highest mountain by far anywhere near Israel, but for the Sumerians or the Babylonians who knew that this mountain was sacred, who had to walk like 4 months to get to Mount Hermon, there were a lot taller, closer mountains if they'd gone east over into what is now Iran. So what is the deal with that particular mountain? I mean, clearly there's something with the location on the 33rd parallel, which David Flynn, and I'll link to this again in the notes, he connected this numerologically to the 1947 Roswell crash.
He did.
Which is also on the 33rd latitude, 33.33 degrees north, just like Mount Hermon. But again, why that mountain? Why there? Why not Mount Zephon, which is the mountain of Baal further north? Or why did God pick Mount Sinai, which we're not even quite sure where it is, but it's surely not as tall as Mount Hermon? What was it about Hermon that made it special?
One of the things Flynn says is that of all the places that are 33 and 33, the only place on land that you find that is Mount Hermon. That's it. Every other place is over water. And so if this is some sort of an important number esoterically to the watchers, this would have been a reason why they could have picked that mountain. And especially as it's connected to so many things on, the earth and how you measure the earth, how you measure distances, how you measure all kinds of things. This would be a good place for that as any. And of course, this is why the Greeks also thought that the Sidonians were kind of the beginning of civilization.
Thirty-three and a third degrees north from the equator is would be pretty easy to find. I mean, okay, if you're gonna go north and south, and you got to start where the midpoint of where the Earth is rotating, but finding 33 degrees east or west depends on where you decide to put zero. And this is one of the things we talked about before the program.
Right.
If you look at today's 33 degrees east, it's actually over the eastern Mediterranean. It's not over Mount Hermon.
Right. That's what's so interesting about how they seem to have picked these two prime meridians, whether it's in Greenwich or it's Paris. They both go over the Atlas Mountains, which would then both go back in some way to this ancient knowledge that somehow the heavens and earth had their tethering right there at that point. And so it makes me think that both Paris and Greenwich had some sort of weird mystical thing that dudes that are into that kind of stuff understood that none of the rest of us understand. And it's very, very interesting that when you use the Paris prime meridian instead of the Greenwich one, you actually land on Mount Hermon instead of out in the sea, like you just said. So
right.
Was there something going on there? I mean, I read that they picked the Paris meridian because that's where King Louis or whoever it was said that this is kind of where Ptolemy's map ended, and so this makes a good place to do it. And I don't know how much I buy that. It seems to me that they're working with knowledge that I'm not privy to.
Here's the other thing I wanted to get into, because you mentioned Mount Hermon and Leviathan chaos. I look at Psalm 68 and I wonder if Psalm 68 isn't at least partly prophetic. This is the one that, beginning at verse 15, reads, "O mountain of God, mountain of Bashan." But as Mike Heiser pointed out, Har Elohim, mountain of God, can also mean mountain of gods, plural, because the mountain of God is Zion. It's not Mount Hermon. Mountain of gods, mountain of Bashan, O many-peaked mountain, mountain of Bashan, why do you look with hatred, O many-peaked mountain, at the mount that God desired for his abode? Yes, where Yahweh the Lord will live forever, will dwell forever. Then verse 17 seems to describe war in the heavenlies. The chariots of God are twice 10,000, thousands upon thousands. The Lord is among them. Sinai is now in the sanctuary, or the Net Bible renders it, the Lord comes from Sinai in holy splendor, which makes more sense. But, and then, Paul actually quotes this, verse 18, "You ascended on high, leading a host of captives in your train and receiving gifts among men, even among the rebellious, that Yahweh God may dwell there." Verse 22, the Lord said, "I will bring them back from Bashan. I will bring them back from the depths of the sea. According to scholar Nicholas Wyatt, that's clunky in the Hebrew, and he says he would prefer to render the Hebrew this way: from Bashan I shall bring back from the depths sea. Now that's significant because sea in Hebrew is Yam, which is the Canaanite name for the chaos dragon, Leviathan. Bashan is just the Hebrew form of Bashmu, which was the chaos dragon of the Akkadians, their form of Tiamat. And right there, on a clear day within eyesight of Mount Hermon, at Gilgal Refaim, you've got this 3/4 of a mile long serpent that is covered with megalithic burials that are, most of them, small versions of Gilgal Refaim. They're covered with rocks, but when Dr. Freakman excavated a few of those, he found that they were like small versions of the wheel, concentric rings around a central tumulus. So is it possible that this connects to Leviathan chaos and that God is putting maybe the Isaiah 27:1 event, on that day, God destroys Leviathan. It happens at Gilgal Refaim, or at least somewhere near Mount Hermon.
Well, I could almost see a double fulfillment going on here with, because when Paul quotes verse 18, I think that my opinion is that has in mind the descent into hell when Jesus is in the grave for 3 days.
Right.
And I think it's verse 21, the hairy crown, like that. That's very strange language that reminds you of satyrs and stuff like that. And then you've got what you're talking about there, bringing them back Bashan. So could it even be a double fulfillment sort of a thing where God is going to strike the Leviathan at the first coming and then again at the second coming?
Mm.
Well, if the place
ahead.
names, the geographical place names in the vicinity of Hermon are any indicator, like the valley that runs on the west side of the mountain is called the Valley of Beth Rahab, and the pre-Greco-Roman name, the Semitic name for Peneus was Beth Rahab. They called it the house of the, and so even in the name there, Rahab, you've got this allusion back to Leviathan references in the Old Testament, and Jesus during his entire ministry is literally fulfilling with every step the Genesis 3:15 prophecy. So there's a lot in terms of geographical legacy that points to all this sort of snake imagery and serpent imagery and the chaos dragon to undergird these older I suppose geographical associations, you might say.
Ezekiel 37. No, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Well, I was just going to say before maybe going to the second coming and those kinds of prophecies, I wonder if it might also be related to Psalm 89, because Bashan shows up there too, and it's very interesting because verse 12 says, "The north and the south you've created them, Tabor and Hermon, joyously praise your name." And some of the church fathers actually used that verse to justify the fact that Mount Tabor was where the transfiguration was going to be, or where it was. But what's strange is that Hermon is right next to it in terms of proximity in the verse, and it's nowhere near it in geography. Mm-hmm. And for whatever reason, Hermon was not really considered very seriously in the early church, I suppose maybe because of Constantine's mother or whatever. Mm-hmm. But as I started preaching through this, I discovered, I forget the source that I found this in, but the guy went to Psalm 89 and found about 4 connections between Matthew and Luke's depiction of, first of all, Peter's confession that Jesus is the Christ, and then the Mount Hermon transfiguration event. And as I started looking, I found like about 20 of them, which is absolutely crazy, which makes me think that Psalm 89, at the end of the day, actually ends up becoming a prophecy of the, what would I call it? I guess I would call it the declaration of the new covenant coming into existence. And then that declaration is put into some sort of a legal declaration on Mount Hermon when the Father says to the Son, "This is my Son with whom I am well pleased." And when you go and look at the Baal cycle, you actually find that this is the very same language that's being used of Yam from El, who says, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased." And it absolutely ticks Baal off, who ends up killing Yam.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're right about the Baal Satan connection, that means that you've got someone else who would be there on Mount Hermon who's listening, just like he was listening in the Baal cycle, when the Father says to this Son, "You are my Son in whom I am well pleased." He's not saying it to Baal Satan. He's saying it to Jesus. Mm-hmm. And this then becomes the moment when Satan is cast like lightning from heaven and he's brought down to the earth. And he then, has 2 months or 3 months or whatever left to try and seek what he's going to do with Jesus, to try and stop this whole thing from happening. I think that you can make a pretty good case that Psalm 89 becomes the prophecy for that entire thing when you look at all the connections that are going on there. So that's why I said that the first coming idea with what you brought up there, Derek, was with Psalm 68:22 is really interesting to me when I think about it in relation to Psalm 89, but I'm never against having double fulfillments. So
yeah, and the hairy forehead of those who are still rebelling. If we are looking at Banyas or Peneus as a place where the goat demons were venerated, that certainly would fit with the geography of that region. I was just going to bring up Ezekiel 37:1. Sharon pointed this out to me. A couple of years ago as we were going through Ezekiel. This is the Valley of the Dry Bones prophecy. The Lord picked him up and set me down in the middle of the valley. The Hebrew word there is actually Bekah, which is the name of the valley that runs west of Mount Hermon all the way up to basically Baalbek and then Mount Sephon in the northern part of Lebanon and Syria. Is a word that means a wide, broad place, but Gesenius, in his Hebrew Chaldee lexicon in the 19th century, suggested that it might be connected to the Bekah Valley. Like,
it's the same place that Rehav is at, isn't it, Judd?
Close, very close, yes.
That's what made me think of it.
Of course, Rahab is another name for the Leviathan.
Mm-hmm.
Beth Rehav, the house or temple of Rehav.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, man. Fascinating stuff. I mean, I pointed out in other discussions of this that, and I mentioned this in a few books, that, because I got it from Lipinski in that article that I sent to you guys, that in the old Babylonian copy of the Gilgamesh epic, they knew that Hermon was special, that after they killed the monster Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest, they penetrated the secret dwelling of the Anunnaki. But by the time of the old Babylonian period, which is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Anunnaki had been demoted. They were judges of the netherworld by that point. So, these were not the space travelers from Nibiru. These were netherworld creatures by that point, which would also put them in the vicinity of Bashan and that whole complex of ideas, with somehow this being connected to the netherworld.
I'm curious what you think about that verse 22 in Psalm 68 in terms of future prophecy, Derek. Where's your mind go with that?
Let me bring that back up again. Psalm 68:22. Just a connection to Isaiah 27 with which I think Isaiah 27, considering that it was written before there were chapter divisions in the scriptures, can finish, rather just continues from Isaiah 26, which makes reference to the Rephaim, beginning at verse 14. They are dead, they will not live. They are Rephaim, they will not arise. To that end, you have visited them with destruction and wiped out all remembrance of them, which is kind of an allusion to the cult of the dead that surrounded ancient Israel, where you had to perform the Kispum ritual once a month, calling the names. Much like a ritual that was performed on our streets during the summer of 2020, say the name and then pour out a libation. It was the same thing the Amorites were doing 4,000 years ago. But then you go down to verse 19. Your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise. You who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy. For your dew is a dew of light, meaning Yahweh, and the earth will give birth to the Rephaim. Bad translation, because the verb give birth, nafal, actually means to fall. Like it's the verb that a lot of people believe Nephilim comes from, like the fallen ones. So the Septuagint renders it, I think, better, the land of the impious or the land of the ungodly will fall. And a scholar named Pearson wrote a paper on Isaiah 26 in the Septuagint, pointing out that probably, given that the Septuagint was translated in era dominated by the Greeks in the Levant, that probably refers to Tartarus and the Titans, who were the watchers, the sons of God from Genesis 6. So the land of the ungodly, Tartarus, and those in it will be destroyed. And then when you continue on to Isaiah 27:1, in that day, the day of the Lord, the day of Yahweh, the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea, will slay the dragon that is in Yam. So my thinking is that if Psalm 68:22 is in fact prophetic, it's just a prophecy of the ultimate destruction of chaos. Like Revelation 21, new heaven and new earth, and the sea was no more.
Mm-hmm.
But isn't that interesting, though, that Psalm 68:22 is talking about, from Bashan I will bring back Yam. The sea is quite a ways west of Mount Hermon. So why would the psalmist connect the sea to this mountain that's, 40, 50 miles inland? Well, we could speculate, but ultimately we'll find out on that day when we get access to the heavenly archives. I'm looking forward to that.
I'll bring up one more thing for the first coming. As I'm thinking about it, I was able to find it here quick enough. This is the Psalm 23 Targum, okay? So, Psalm of David, it is the Lord who fed his people in the wilderness. They lack nothing. In a place of thirst, he makes me rest among the beauty of grass. Beside gentle waters, he leads me. He restores my soul with manna. He leads me in the ways of righteousness for the sake of his name. Even when I go into exile in the valley of shadow of death, I will not fear evil, because your memra, your word, your logos, is my support. Your straight staff and your law, they comfort me. You spread a table before me. And then the Midrash adds this, the table of the flesh of Leviathan. Manna is raised up in front of my oppressors, and you make my body fat with stout birds and the heads of the priests and the anointing oil. So you brought up Kerbet Bektah, the smaller version of the Gilgal Refaim earlier, Derek, and that happens to be over there just right across the street from where the disciples grew up, north of the sea, overlooking the Jordan Valley. And it's very possible that this is where Jesus actually fed the 5,000. And there was two petroglyphs that were found there. As I recall, one of them was a snake. Yep. And then the other one was somehow related to the food as well. I forget what
fish.
It was, but
Fish.
it was. That's right. It was the fish. That's right.
In fact, as we're recording this, I did that presentation. I did a presentation on that in North Dakota. And I actually got the images that Dr. Mike Freakman had put into his dissertation, and credited you with pointing it out, because I'd forgotten that I'd seen those when I read his dissertation. But people saw it, watching it, were like,
Yeah, I mean, it's such a wild thing, and the idea there that Jesus is actually, we're in the geography of the Valley of the Shadow of Death, as you've pointed out before. That's just south of Mount Hermon, and Jesus is here feeding them with these fish, and you've got Leviathan being the fish. There's an idea that the first coming then, and what Jesus was doing is he's starting to fulfill the messianic prophecies that were there in the Midrash later on and in the Targum later on that the Jews didn't believe had actually happened. And Jesus is saying, it's already happened, guys. I'm feeding the people right now on the flesh of Leviathan because I'm the victor over him, and everything that's taking place in terms of that sacred geography in all of Galilee. Most of the things Jesus is doing really is related to Mount Hermon, with Mount Hermon really just being the climax of what he does, where he declares to the entities on El's mountain, as you've pointed out from the Lipinski article. That's what Mount Hermon was. It was the mountain of the divine assembly of El and his 70 sons. This is where Jesus decides to go and tell the whole world that I'm here. What are you going to do about it? And so they kill him. And oops, that was the exact wrong plan, because that's exactly what God had ordained to happen so that he could actually win the war.
Psalm 74, you got you crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for creatures in the wilderness. So yeah, it's a theme that is woven through the Scripture if you're looking for it. But unfortunately, most of us in church on Sunday mornings don't get that those threads connected together.
That's why we're doing a show on Mount Hermon, because if you can start with Mount Hermon, then it's just like spokes in a wheel. It all just starts spreading out, and you're able to start seeing a lot of these connections, because it really is ground zero for so much of the biblical worldview. I mean, it's just hard to overemphasize how true that actually is.
Yeah. Well, I got to admit, this is why I love doing this show. I didn't expect us to be spending most of our focus on the astronomical procession and the connection between Leviathan and chaos and Mount Hermon, but it's there.
It's there.
It's there, and it's the Watchers. That is what Leviathan, that's what the dragon, that is what they're symbolizing. And I really do think, again, that when Enoch is talking about what they taught men, that it's going back to this kind of knowledge, and forbidden knowledge is really what it was. And, that becomes the depravity point of that God ends up destroying the world because of that. And we still have monuments on the ground in that very area and on top of that very mountain that are commemorating this event. It's pretty remarkable.
And the United Nations with us, an observation post right there next to the summit. Well, they're just watching.
Yeah, nothing fishy about that.
That was a whale of a good one, Judd.
There we go. All right. I got nothing. Well, this is why we find the Bible is not boring. If you think the Bible is boring, it's because you've been taught that the stuff that's in it is just made up. No, there's a lot of meat in there.
Yeah, that was a pretty good one.
Yeah. But you may have to dig a little bit. Dr. Judd Burton, Doug Van Dorn, next month back with our friend Brian Godawa. Guys, this was a great one. Appreciate it. Check the notes below this podcast, whether you're watching or listening, for links to the websites for Dr. Judd Burton, Doug Van Dorn, and yes, we'll even include Brian Godawa, not appearing in this month's Iron and Myth episode. We'll include him anyway. Find those, because we really enjoy conversing with those guys and sharing our research back and forth. And Iron and Myth number 34 coming next month, hopefully with a full crew once again. Coming up, we're going to tell you how you can save 10% on an upcoming conference at which Sharon will be one of the featured speakers. Talk about conference in December, how you can get your own, I guess better if I hold it over here. Yes, we have merch. We have merch, and how you can use the merch to get yourself some merch and benefit two ministries at the same time. That and poor woman in Canada charged with assault with a weapon for accidentally spraying a neighbor with a squirt gun. That, as A View from the Bunker continues.
It's time for back to school, and we have a special offer in September at the Gilbert House store.
Back to school, it's impossible to believe. Where did the year go? Well, October is also approaching, so we have a deal for you. $35 only plus shipping and handling will get you 2 amazing books and a CD, which is interviews with Dr. Michael Heiser.
Preparing you for All Hallows Eve, the month of October, when we begin to think about the spirit realm, our book Veneration, which takes a deep dive into the cult of the Nephilim around ancient Israel, the source of the demons that plague the world to this day.
And also a wonderful book by our friend Vicki Joy Anderson. They only come out at night. This is your manual for spiritual warfare. This should be in your church library.
Those 2 books plus a 7-hour audio CD with Dr. Michael S. Heiser discussing the unseen realm. These 2 books plus the CD, just $35 plus shipping and handling only at gilberthouse.org/store.
They thought Queen Jezebel would bring diversity and progress to ancient Israel. She brought Baal, the storm god of Canaan. Chronicles of the Watchers is a series of biblical novels by best-selling author Brian Godawa, charting the influence of spiritual warfare on human history. The War of Gods and Men. A must-read, Jezebel, Harlot Queen of Israel, in the series Chronicles of the Watchers. Available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook at Amazon.com. That's Chronicles of the Watchers by Brian Godawa at Amazon.com.
Talking the Walk every Sunday night from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. You'll find us online at VFTB.net. That's where all the archives are located. Subscribe there, do all that stuff. Find us on social media. By the way, our other websites, gilberthouse.org. That's the main web hub for everything that Sharon and I do. My personal website, derekpgilbert.com. Social media, X, formerly Twitter, at View from Bunker, at Derek Gilbert, or at Gilbert House _TV. You'll also find us on Truth Social, Gab Me We Getter, at Derek P. Gilbert, and on YouTube at Gilbert House. If you're there, subscribe, share, click that bell for notifications, smash the like button, and then please download our free mobile app to your smartphone or tablet. That not only gets all of our content right into your hands, you can take it around with you wherever you go, whether you've got iOS, Android, or Amazon Kindle Fire in your phone or inside your tablet, but it also bypasses the gatekeepers of big tech. Also gives you an opportunity to join in the conversation in the messaging section. Ask questions directly of Sharon and me. Ask and give prayer for one another. And just comment on these programs and share your thoughts and ideas. Maybe tip us off to things that Sharon and I might have spotted in the news. The app is free. It's available, again, for iOS, Android, Amazon Kindle Fire, and available at gilberthouse.org/app. By the way, also versions for Roku, Apple TV, and now Amazon Fire TV. So if you got a smart TV with one of those operating systems, or one of those set-top boxes, Fire Stick, Roku, Amazon, or Fire, Apple TV, whatever, please add the Gilbert House TV app to that device as well. The content comes straight from the Christian company that has developed the app to your device and bypasses the gatekeepers of big tech. Now, the crummy commercial merch, Gilbert House TV mugs. We are also getting PID Radio. That's the podcast Sharon and I have been doing since 2005 that started this whole thing. Caps, mugs, and wearables. The GHTV t-shirt, which I wore during the discussion with Doug and Judd. That's what it looks like. It looks even better when it's in front of my face, doesn't it? I said it so you didn't have to. But not only that, if you're a fan of Sharon's Red Wing Saga series of supernatural thrillers, there you go. Show your loyalty with a Red Wing Saga t-shirt. And best of all, this is coming from our friends at Light Hive Creations, which is Kenny C. and his fiancee Gidget Manning. And what they're doing with their share of the proceeds. See, Kenny is a music teacher He teaches mostly kids, although Doug Van Dorn is one of his students. Doug and Janelle Van Dorn's daughter are among Kenny's students. What Kenny uses the proceeds for is to buy instruments for kids who are taking lessons from him whose families cannot afford instruments, because sometimes these musical instruments can be really expensive. Guitars, keyboards, especially, horns. So you can help us out a little bit, help out Kenny and his music students, and you'll find the link for the merch at gilberthouse.org/store. Well, one of the items in the news this week caught my attention because it's just so ridiculous. It's hard to believe that this is happening, except that you remember it's the 21st century, and everything you do right now that involves any bit of fun is probably going to offend somebody. And if we've learned nothing from the last 8 years in the Trump era, it's that anything that offends anybody else is probably illegal, especially in Canada. 58-year-old woman in Simcoe, Ontario, has been arrested and charged with assault with a weapon. Now, this woman works as an educational assistant, loves kids, saw children in her neighborhood out playing in front of her house, summer day, with squirt guns, or as they say in Canada, water guns. I grew up, we called them squirt guns, even the really cool Nerf guns that shoot, a long way. Anyhow, she apparently has one, loaded it up, went outside to join in the fun with the kids. And while chasing a kid across the front yard and having a good time, she inadvertently sprayed her next-door neighbor who was mowing the lawn. Now, this is a fellow who apparently has a reputation in the neighborhood. Reportedly, I should say, not apparently. He reportedly, according to neighbors, is known for calling police for minor, ridiculous infractions, weaponizing the police against his neighbors. He called the cops. Police showed up, talked to him, didn't talk to her, and charged her with assault with a weapon for hitting him accidentally. Even she apologized because she lives next door to him. She knows what he's like. Don't know what he told the police. It could have been anything in there. There might have been COVIDs in there. So she's been suspended, put on leave anyway, from her employer, the school district, which has caused financial hardship for her family, and obviously the stress of knowing you got to go to court and defend yourself, the stress and the expense of having to pay for legal representation. This is ridiculous, but this is the world we live in the 21st century, at least in some parts of Canada and the United States, where there is no such thing as having fun. I mean, you would think that the peace officers could have said, "Sir, it was an accident. You're not harmed. It was water. Just calm down." No, he insisted on pressing charges, and she is facing a charge of assault with a weapon. The weapon being a squirt gun. To the police department of Simcoe, Ontario, we say, bless your pointy little heads. Coming up in just a few weeks now, the Inspiring Women's webinar. This will be online, of course, presented by Hear the Watchmen, hearthewatchmen.com. Sharon, one of the presenters, along with our friends Vicki Joy Anderson, Tracy Tennant, Heidi Begley, other women like Leslie Johnson, and more. And here's the deal. You can get a 10% discount just by using the promo code Gilbert10, Gilbert10 when you check out. And you get 10% off. Not only do you get access to the recorded presentations, Sharon and I turned in hers a couple of weeks ago. She's doing a presentation on how she found her voice, which, if you know her background, she was a professional vocalist for a couple of decades. I mean, not just touring with bands, but singing jingles professionally with the likes of Sandy Patty and Steve Green. Yeah, that's my wife. As my dad told me more than once, "Son, you married up." But she speaks with a different voice now, the written word, and sometimes the spoken word. So you can find that up, hear that story on as part of this Inspiring Women webinar. And then on Sunday, October 6th, it goes live on October 4th, Friday the 4th. But on Sunday the 6th, there is a live event where you can interact with the speakers, ask questions directly, and all of this is available at hearthewatchmen.com. That's Hear the Watchmen, plural, and use promo code Gilbert10, Gilbert10 at checkout for a 10% discount. Our I'll talk about our Israel tour in just a moment. We will be in Branson for Christmas, the Christmas in Branson Prophecy Conference, December 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th. That is from our good friends at Prophecy Watchers, Gary Steeman, Mondo Gonzalez, Josh Peck. They will be there along with L.A. Marzulli, Bill Salas, Ken Johnson, Billy Crone, Doug Hershey, Brandon Holthouse, and others, Olivier Melnick. This is quite a lineup, and I'm honored to be one of the speakers among that crew. And we hope we see you there. Again, the Christmas in Branson Prophecy Conference, December 5th through 8th. Information online at prophecywatchers.com. Follow the link from the calendar section of our app or at our website, gilberthouse.org, or go to BransonChristmasProphecyConference.com, and you can sign up there. Now, our Israel tour that we had planned for November, our Solidarity Mission, our one-week tour, we have decided to cancel because of the security situation in the Middle East. Apparently, that is worrying enough people to it just did not look like it was going to be financially feasible to make this work. So we are going to cancel that. We are still planning to be in Israel, God willing, next spring, March 25th through April 3rd, the Iron and Myth Israel tour with Doug Van Dorn, Dr. Judd Burton, and playing the part of Brian Godawa will be Timothy Alberino. And you can join us for that. We plan to visit all of the sites that we normally visit. The Grotto of Pan, Caesarea Philippi at the foot of Mount Hermon. We'll go to the Golan Heights, visit Gilgal Refaim and the Serpent Mound of Bashan. Of course, the important sites in Jerusalem, like the Temple Mount, the Mount of Olives, the City of David, and more. And the whole itinerary, the sites we plan to visit, all at our website, gilberthouse.org/travel. gilberthouse.org/travel, and if there are any changes, updates, that information will always be there. And from that site, of course, you can link directly to Lipkin Tours website to sign up and register for your spot in the 2025 Iron and Myth Tour of Israel. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to watch or listen, as the case may be. If you're watching again at YouTube, please subscribe, share, click the bell for notifications, then download our free app. If you're listening, whether it's at Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, Amazon Music, Audible, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, or wherever fine podcasts are sold, thank you. And if you get a spare moment, we'd appreciate a good review. Our announcer, the inimitable D.C. Good. And as always, A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House Ministries, released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. Please pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Good night, Oliver, wherever you are. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.